Welcome to our deep dive. And today, it's something I think we could all use a little more insight on, maybe even a little help with. Toxic behavior. We'll be taking a close look at Kevin Ashford's book, How to Stop Being Toxic, trying to figure out together how to not only spot these patterns in others, but also, maybe in ourselves, and most importantly, how we can break free.
Yeah. I mean, who doesn't want a less toxic life? It's tough to look inward, for sure, but that's really where it all starts, right?
Absolutely. And Ashford really gets into how toxic behavior isn't always this big, obvious thing. It can be kind of sneaky, almost like camouflage.
Right. He even compares it to how animals in nature blend in to survive. You don't see them until, well, sometimes it's too late. Toxic behaviors can be like that, hiding in plain sight until they've already done the damage.
And it's not always about someone being a bad person, is it? It's more about recognizing those patterns that hurt ourselves and others, even if we don't mean to.
Exactly. We've all probably been on the receiving end of those comments that seem harmless on the surface, but leave you feeling kind of, well, yucky.
Oh, yeah, totally. Like those little digs disguised as compliments. Ashford actually calls out things like guilt trips. Stuff like, after all I've done for you. Or the classic passive-aggressive sighing when someone forgets to do something.
And don't forget those backhanded compliments, the ones that leave you wondering if they were even meant to be nice in the first place.
Right, those can be the worst.
Yeah.
And Ashford explains how, over time, these seemingly small things create this negativity. He compares it to poison, slowly polluting a social ecosystem. It might not kill you right away, but it definitely takes its toll.
It's true. A little negativity here, a little resentment there, it all builds up. Before you know it, trust is eroded and relationships are strained. It's like a slow drip, drip, drip.
This is where things get a little more, personal.
Yeah.
Ashford really challenges us to take a good, hard look in the mirror. He asks some tough questions like, have you ever just brushed off feedback? Or do you find it difficult to celebrate other people's successes?
Yeah, those are the kind of questions that make you squirm a little. But, that's where the real self-awareness starts. Ashford uses this analogy about having spinach in your teeth. We often miss our own toxic traits, even if they're super obvious to everyone else.
Oh, I love that. It's so true. Sometimes we need a little help seeing those things in ourselves. And he shares this story about Maria, this marketing executive who thought she was, a fantastic boss. But through some reflection, she realized she was actually pretty controlling, very critical, and often ignored how her team was feeling.
Maria's story is such a great example of how good intentions don't always equal a positive impact. Her own insecurities were actually driving her to micromanage and criticize. Without even realizing it, she was creating this toxic environment. It's a good reminder that we all have the potential to be Maria in someone else's story.
It makes you think, doesn't it? Okay, let's be real here. We all make excuses for our behavior sometimes. I'm just stressed. That's just how I am.
Oh, absolutely. We've all been there. We're only human.
But here's where Ashford's insights are super helpful. He explains how those excuses, while they might make us feel better in the moment, are actually preventing us from growing, from really changing.
It's like we're building this wall around our ego, protecting ourselves from discomfort, but also trapping ourselves in these toxic patterns.
He gives examples, like blaming stress for lashing out, or using that, well, it's just how I am,
Yeah.
line to avoid taking responsibility for actually changing, actually becoming better. He calls these things roadblocks. What I found helpful is his concept of what he calls the responsibility ladder.
Oh, yeah, the responsibility ladder. It's such a good visual, right? It's about realizing we can choose to step up, own our part, even if it's uncomfortable.
Exactly. Instead of pointing the finger, we can start climbing that ladder step by step towards taking more responsibility for our actions.
It might sound cliche, but taking responsibility really is empowering. It means you're not just a passenger in your own life, but you're actually at the wheel.
It's about taking control, right? Speaking of taking control, Ashford talks about these negative thought cycles that can really take over. He has this analogy.
Yeah.
Imagine your mind is like a garden, and those negative thoughts, well, they're like weeds choking out all the good stuff.
It's a great image, right? Really makes you think about how quickly those negative thoughts can spread if we let them. And that's where those distorted thinking patterns come in, those thought traps that can really mess with our perception, like, making one mistake and suddenly thinking you're a complete failure.
Right, one little slip up and it's like the whole world is crashing down. Ashford gives examples that I think a lot of us can relate to. Things like, oh, this mistake proves I'm useless, or I just know they all think I'm incompetent. Those are the kinds of anxieties that can really drive toxic behaviors, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And the key is recognizing them and then, well, challenging them. Ashford gives some steps on how to do this. Ask yourself, is this thought even true? Is it helpful? What's the evidence? It's about bringing some logic, some reason into those often very irrational thought patterns.
Like we're becoming detectives of our own minds. Okay, so imagine this. You're on this emotional roller coaster. Things are getting intense. You're feeling that anger, the frustration bubbling up. How do you stay in control before you do something you'll regret?
That's where emotional regulation comes in, right? Ashford really breaks it down. It's about understanding our emotions, recognizing them, and then, well, managing them. He talks about this tiny little pause, that split second between feeling and reacting. That pause is where you can take back your power.
He even suggests things as simple as counting to 10, taking some deep breaths. Seems basic, but in those heated moments, I can see how it could be super effective. What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. Deep breathing is my go-to. Just a few breaths can change your whole perspective. And Ashford emphasizes that it's not just about calming down. It's about becoming more aware of what's actually going on inside. Just naming the emotion. Okay, right now I'm feeling angry, or wow, I'm feeling overwhelmed. Just acknowledging it can create some distance and help you manage that intensity.
It's like hitting the pause button on that roller coaster so you
Uh,
can, decide how you want to proceed instead of just letting it take you for a wild ride.
exactly. It puts you back in the driver's seat, which I think is a great transition to what Ashford talks about next. Empathy. He calls it a superpower.
He talks about a world with less conflict, more genuine connection. Who wouldn't want that? But how do we actually cultivate more empathy? Where do we even begin?
Well, Ashford gives some pretty practical exercises, actually. He talks about active listening, really focusing on what the other person is saying, not just waiting for your turn to talk, but really trying to understand their point of view.
Like really putting ourselves in their shoes, considering their feelings, their experiences.
Right. And he also mentions validation, not necessarily agreeing, but just acknowledging and accepting that the other person's feelings are valid, that they make sense, even if we don't see things the same way.
It's about creating a space for real, open communication, right? Which can help, I think, de-escalate conflict and build stronger connections. And speaking of creating a safe space, both for ourselves and in our relationships, Ashford really emphasizes boundaries. He compares them to a personal force field, deflecting all that negativity, protecting your energy.
It's a great way to think about it, right? Boundaries are like those invisible shields we need to protect ourselves, to make sure we're not getting drained or taken advantage of.
They're not selfish, are they? They're actually essential for healthy relationships.
Absolutely. Ashford really drives that point home. Boundaries are about self-respect, and they're crucial for preventing resentment, burnout, all those things that can fuel those toxic behaviors.
And he addresses that fear a lot of us have about setting boundaries, that worry that we'll be seen as mean or selfish, which is understandable, right?
Of course, it can be scary to say no, to put our foot down, but what Ashford says is so important. Setting boundaries isn't selfish, it's actually an act of self-care.
And it's about saying yes to our own well-being, right? He even gives examples of how to do it. Like, thank you for thinking of me, but I can't take that on right now. Or, I'm flattered you asked, but that doesn't work for me.
It's about being clear and direct, but still respectful. And remember, boundaries only work if we enforce them consistently.
Like, we can't just set them and forget them, right? We have to actually hold those lines.
Right. It's about being, kind but firm, like a well-trained bouncer at the door to your life. You're in control. Okay, so we've covered a lot here in this first section.
And one thing's clear. We all have the potential for both toxic behaviors and growth. Recognizing those patterns is the first step. But what comes next?
Ashford reminds us that self-awareness is not like a one-time thing, It's a journey. We're always learning, always noticing those patterns, understanding those triggers, and choosing to respond differently.
It's like, well, we're always peeling back layers, uncovering those hidden parts of ourselves.
And speaking of layers, Ashford talks about how those toxic behaviors, they often come from somewhere deeper.
Right, deeper issues like insecurity, maybe past trauma, even learned behaviors from childhood. It's like those experiences, they create these defense mechanisms. And those mechanisms can, unfortunately, show up as toxic behaviors.
So it's not just about addressing the behavior itself. It's about understanding where it's coming from. That's where the real healing starts, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And Ashford recommends journaling. It can be a powerful tool for self-reflection. He even suggests keeping what he calls a trigger journal, where you can log those moments when you react strongly, maybe a little too intensely, a little too negatively. That's a great idea. Like we become scientists of our own emotions, collecting data on our patterns. We start to notice, okay, this situation, this behavior, it tends to trigger those toxic responses.
It's about connecting those dots, right? Connecting our past experiences with our current triggers and the behaviors we want to change.
Sometimes, though, it's hard to see those connections on our own. We need a little help, a fresh perspective. Ashford talks about how important it is to get feedback from others.
Yes, it's like sometimes those blind spots, they're only visible to other people. He suggests asking those you trust, like close friends, family members, for their honest feedback. It can be tough to hear, but it's so valuable.
It takes courage to say, hey, have you ever noticed me doing this? Or how do you feel when I do that?
Mm.
But it shows you're serious about growth.
And when we get that feedback, the key is to really listen. No defensiveness, just taking that information in and using it to understand ourselves better, even if it stings a little.
So let's say you've done the self-reflection, you've gotten some feedback, and you've pinpointed some toxic behaviors.
Yeah.
Now what? How do you actually start to change those patterns?
Ashford says it's time to step up and let go of those excuses. It's about owning our actions, making a conscious decision to do things differently.
Easier said than done, I think. It's so easy to slip back into those familiar excuses. I'm just stressed. This is just who I am.
It's our comfort zone, right? Those excuses, they might offer temporary relief, but they keep us stuck.
They protect our ego, but they prevent real change. Ashford really emphasizes that taking responsibility, even though it can be uncomfortable, it's actually empowering.
It's about realizing that we have a choice. We have the power to choose a different path.
And that power comes from recognizing the impact our actions have on others. Ashford encourages us to ask, what would taking responsibility look like in this situation?
Mm.
And then, well, actually doing it. It's not just about words, it's about action.
And sometimes that action involves making things right. Ashford talks about the importance of apologizing when we've hurt someone with our toxic behaviors.
It's not just about saying, I'm sorry, though. It's about acknowledging the impact of what we did, expressing genuine remorse, and, doing what we can to repair the damage.
He gives examples of what a sincere apology sounds like. It's about taking ownership, validating the other person's feelings, and committing to change. It's about rebuilding that trust.
So we've talked about recognizing toxic behaviors, understanding those root causes, taking responsibility, making amends. Now let's get back to those negative thought patterns that can fuel those toxic behaviors in the first place. How do we break free from those mental traps?
Ashford actually dedicates a whole chapter to this, packed with helpful strategies. He starts by explaining how those negative thought patterns, like, all or nothing thinking or jumping to conclusions, they distort how we see things.
It's like we're wearing these negativity goggles, filtering out all the good stuff, focusing on the bad. We get caught in these loops, these mental loops, and it's hard to break free.
And those distorted thoughts, they lead to negative emotions, which fuel those toxic behaviors. It's like a vicious cycle. Ashford gives examples of those thoughts that I think a lot of us have experienced. Things like, ugh, I always mess things up, or I'm such a failure.
Yeah, we've all been there. It's so easy to fall into those traps. But what's helpful is how Ashford lays out a process for actually challenging those thoughts. He says, ask yourself, is this thought even true? Is it helpful? What's the evidence?
It's like taking a step back, looking at those thoughts objectively, examining the evidence, considering different perspectives.
And once we've challenged those negative thoughts, Ashford talks about, replacing them with more productive ones.
It's not about denying reality or forcing positivity. It's about finding more balanced, more helpful ways of thinking.
He suggests things like practicing gratitude, focusing on our growth rather than perfection, and, just being kind to ourselves.
That self-compassion piece is so important, isn't it? It's about treating ourselves with the same kindness we would offer a friend.
Speaking of retraining our brains, Ashford also talks about the importance of emotional regulation in managing those toxic behaviors.
It all comes back to that emotional roller coaster, doesn't it? Emotional regulation, it's about recognizing, understanding, and managing our emotions, especially in those heated moments when we're most likely to, say or do something we'll regret later.
He really emphasizes that pause, that split second between feeling and reacting. That's where we have the power to choose.
And he gives a whole bunch of practical tools to help us create that pause. Deep breathing, counting to 10, even just naming the emotion we're feeling. And it's not just about calming down, it's about awareness, understanding what's happening inside so we can make conscious choices.
It's like we're creating this map of our emotional landscape so we can navigate those tricky terrains more skillfully.
And once we know our triggers, we can start to figure out how to manage them. Maybe it's removing ourselves from the situation, practicing a relaxation technique, or just reframing our thoughts.
Ashford makes it clear, emotional regulation is a skill. It takes practice. It's not always easy, but it's one of the most powerful tools we have for overcoming those knee-jerk reactions, those toxic patterns.
It's about taking control of that roller coaster, not letting it control us. And I think this is a good point to shift our focus a bit. How does all of this play out in our relationships with others?
We've been talking a lot about the individual level, right? So now how do we take these principles, these tools, and apply them to our interactions with others? Ashford dedicates a whole chapter to empathy, right? How it can transform our relationships.
It's all about understanding and sharing the feelings of another person, seeing the world from their perspective, even if it's different from our own.
It's like stepping outside of our own heads and trying to walk in their shoes for a bit. And Ashford argues that empathy is the antidote to so much of the toxicity we see in the world.
He's so right. When we can truly understand where someone is coming from, we're less likely to judge, to criticize, to react defensively. We're more likely to respond with compassion.
And he gives those exercises for developing empathy, things like active listening and perspective taking, like we talked about before.
And then there's validation, remembering that it's not about agreeing, but just acknowledging and accepting the other person's feelings.
He gives examples of phrases we can use like, that sounds really frustrating, or I can see why you would feel that way. It's up creating that sense of safety, of understanding, which can really help to de-escalate conflict and build stronger connections.
It's powerful stuff. And that brings us to boundaries, which Ashford emphasizes are absolutely essential for healthy relationships. They're like those invisible lines that define our personal space, our values, our needs, and our limits.
And he addresses that common fear around setting boundaries, right?
Mhm.
The worry that will come across as selfish or mean.
It's a valid concern, for sure. But what Ashford points out is that boundaries are actually an act of self-respect. They're crucial for preventing resentment, burnout, all those things that can lead to those toxic behaviors.
It's not selfish to protect your own well-being. In fact, it's essential if we want to show up as our best selves in our relationships.
Absolutely. So how do we go about setting those boundaries? Ashford says, be assertive, communicate your needs clearly but respectfully.
Use I statements like, I need some time alone right now, or I'm not comfortable talking about that.
It's about stating your needs without blaming or attacking. And just as important as setting our own boundaries is respecting the boundaries of others.
It's about listening both to what they're saying and what they're not saying, honoring their limits.
Sometimes that means saying no, even when it's hard. And it also means accepting no when it's given to us.
Ashford says, setting and respecting boundaries, it takes practice. But it's one of the most important things we can do for ourselves and for our relationships. It creates this foundation of respect and understanding.
Okay, so we've talked about empathy, about boundaries, but what about the actual communication itself? How do we make sure we're communicating in a way that's clear, assertive, and, non-toxic?
That's a great question. And you know what? Ashford has a whole chapter on communication.
He starts by explaining how poor communication can lead to, all sorts of problems. Misunderstandings, hurt feelings, conflicts. He calls it the toxicity telephone, where messages get all jumbled up, assumptions are made, and things just escalate.
That's such a good analogy. It's like that game of telephone we played as kids, remember? The message gets distorted with each retelling.
It shows just how important it is to be clear, to be direct. And he talks about how passive communication, where we bottle up our feelings and avoid conflict, it can be just as toxic as aggressive communication.
It's about finding that balance, that assertive middle ground where we can express our thoughts and feelings openly and respectfully, without going to either extreme.
That's the sweet spot, expressing your needs while being open to the other person's perspective.
And he gives tips for practicing assertive communication. Use those I statements. Be specific about your needs. Express your feelings directly.
And don't forget about active listening. It's about really paying attention to what the other person is saying, trying to understand their point of view, asking questions for clarity.
It's about putting those phones away, making eye contact, really tuning in both to their words and, to their body language.
Ashford also provides this framework for resolving conflict constructively. He suggests taking a break if things get too heated, focusing on understanding the other person's perspective and then working together to find a solution that works for everyone.
It's about turning those arguments, those disagreements, into opportunities to grow closer, rather than letting them turn into these toxic battles.
And he also talks about clear communication in digital spaces, which can be tricky. We don't have those nonverbal cues, the tone of voice, the facial expressions. It's easy to misinterpret things.
He says be extra clear in your wording, use emojis carefully, and always reread your messages before hitting send.
And sometimes, he says, it's just better to pick up the phone or talk face to face, especially if it's a sensitive topic.
Makes sense. It's so easy for things to get lost in translation online.
Hmm.
Okay, so we've talked about recognizing toxic behaviors, understanding the root causes, taking responsibility, managing our thoughts and emotions, communicating clearly. But what about forgiveness? What about forgiving ourselves for those times when we mess up?
That's such an important question. Ashford actually has a whole chapter on self-forgiveness. He says that holding on to guilt and shame for our past mistakes, it actually prevents us from making real change.
It's like we get stuck in this cycle of self-criticism, beating ourselves up, which just reinforces those toxic patterns.
And he emphasizes that self-forgiveness isn't about, condoning our past behavior or letting ourselves off the hook. It's about acknowledging the impact of our actions, expressing remorse, and making a conscious choice to move forward with compassion and wisdom.
It's about recognizing that we all make mistakes. We're all works in progress, right? We all deserve to offer ourselves that same grace and forgiveness we would offer to someone else.
And Ashford gives some great steps for practicing self-forgiveness. Things like acknowledging the impact of our actions, taking responsibility, and making amends if possible. And of course, practicing that self-compassion.
It's about silencing that inner critic and offering ourselves words of support instead.
He also talks about rewriting our story, shifting from, I'm just a toxic person to I'm learning, I'm growing, I'm becoming better. It's about recognizing that we are capable of change, that our past doesn't define us, and that we are worthy of forgiveness.
He even suggests a forgiveness ritual where you write a letter to yourself, acknowledging those mistakes, expressing remorse, and then, actually destroying the letter, like physically letting go of the past.
That sounds really powerful. It's about closing that chapter and starting a new one filled with growth and healing.
Okay, so we've covered so much important ground here. We've talked about how to recognize those toxic behaviors, understand their roots, manage our thoughts and emotions, communicate effectively, and forgive ourselves. But here's the real challenge. How do we make these changes last? How do we create a future where those toxic behaviors are less likely to pop up again?
That's where Ashford's final chapter comes in. It's all about maintaining those positive changes and creating a healthier, happier future. And he starts by saying, personal growth, it's not a one-time fix. It's an ongoing process. It takes effort. It takes a willingness to keep learning and growing.
It's about embracing that journey, right? Knowing there will be bumps along the way, but staying committed to becoming the best versions of ourselves. It can feel kind of overwhelming, right? Like, where do you even begin?
It's a lot to take in, for sure. But Ashford breaks it down, He focuses on building new habits step by step to replace those old patterns.
So like trading in those toxic behaviors for healthier ones.
Exactly. He talks about this method called if-then planning. It's about, identifying those triggers, those situations that tend to set you off, and then creating a plan for how you'll respond differently.
So instead of reacting in that same old toxic way, you have a different response ready to go.
Right. Like if I feel myself getting defensive, then I'll take a deep breath and try to see things from their perspective. It's like having a game plan so you're not caught off guard.
Being prepared for those moments when those old habits try to sneak back in.
Exactly. It's about being proactive. And Ashford also talks about shifting your mindset around change. Instead of seeing it as this, this loss, this restriction, he says, try to see it as an opportunity.
Like you're not giving something up, you're gaining something even better.
Right. And he also talks about building resilience, that ability to bounce back when things get tough. Because let's face it, they will. There will be setbacks. There will be moments when we slip up,
We're human. It happens.
Exactly. It's not about being perfect. It's about learning from those moments and, getting back on track.
It's like learning to ride a bike, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're going to fall a few times, but you get back up, dust yourself off, and keep going.
And Ashford reminds us that we don't have to do this alone. He talks about having a good support system, surrounding ourselves with people who lift us up, who encourage our growth.
People who believe in us.
Exactly. He says, take a look at your relationships. Which ones are truly supportive and which ones, well, maybe they're not so helpful.
We might need to make some changes, create a more supportive environment.
It can be tough, but it's so important.
And don't be afraid to be vulnerable with those people you trust. You know, share your struggles, your successes. Ask for help when you need it.
And sometimes, we need a little extra guidance. Ashford talks about finding mentors, coaches, people who can offer support and advice.
People who've been there, done that, and can share their wisdom. And finally, Ashford says, keep track of your progress, celebrate those wins, and don't be afraid to adjust your course as you go.
It's all about that continuous improvement, right? Always striving to be a little bit better. It's a journey, not a destination.
He suggests journaling, using habit tracking apps, or just, taking some time for yourself to reflect on how you're doing. What about you? What really stuck with you from this book? What felt the most helpful?
For me, it was that reminder that we all have the capacity for both, for toxicity and for growth. It's not about labeling ourselves as good or bad. It's about awareness, about making conscious choices to move towards more compassion, more connection.
And that change is possible. It might not always be easy, but it's so worth it.
And the best part is, even small changes can have a big impact. It's those little steps, those daily choices that really add up over time.
So we want to leave you with a little something to think about. Ashford challenges us to consider one relationship in our lives where setting better boundaries could make the biggest difference. Which relationship comes to mind for you? That's your starting point. Think about one small change you can make today to start building healthier boundaries in that relationship. Maybe it's having an honest conversation about your needs. Maybe it's saying no to something that doesn't feel right. Maybe it's just starting to pay attention to those subtle signs that your boundaries are being crossed. Remember, you have the power to change not only your own life, but the lives of those around you. By choosing to be less toxic, you create a ripple effect of positivity that goes far beyond yourself. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and keep choosing kindness.